As you notice, Mike Moeller is not standing here. I was asked to substitute for him just to say that Mike is going to moderate our next panel. He is eminently qualified to do that, having operated from the point of the spear, as we say in the military, all the way to the very highest levels of the government. So our panel is on power in leadership, projection, and protection. And I can't think of a group of folks who are more qualified to be able to talk about this. And so, Mike, over to you, and I know this is going to be a great panel.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it very much. Can everybody hear me? Great. Last panel of the day. And I'm biased, but the best panel of the day. Let me do an introduction before I offer my esteemed colleagues an opportunity to provide their comments. We'll do 20 minutes or so of moderated discussion, and then same rules apply. We'll have an opportunity for the audience to ask questions. So let's get started. On my right is Major General Spider Marks. He had a long, distinguished, outstanding career in the United States Army, where he commanded at every level. He is a combat leader. He's an instructor, and he is a strategist. After retirement, he went into a number of business opportunities. He's an entrepreneur, and you may recognize that profile because you see him as a national security analyst on CNN. Welcome, Spider.
Thanks, Mike.
Next to General Marks is Ms. Maura Rudman. She is the Senior Vice President at Business Executives for National Security. She has spent a lifetime in public service as a diplomat, both with assignments in the State Department and as one of the directors for assistant directors, deputy directors for USAID. She has also been the deputy assistant to the President of the United States on national security affairs. And I had the great privilege of working with Maura when she was the deputy to Senator George Mitchell, when he was the special envoy for the Middle East peace process. Welcome, Maura. And then finally, certainly last but not least, is our returning guest from last year, Major General Garrett Yee. He is the assistant to the director for the Defense Information Systems Agency. He is the leading expert in the Department of Defense on cyberspace operations, cyberspace security, and information operations. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is truly a distinguished panel, so let's get started.
I think one of the most influential global leaders that I would want to reference is a guy named Churchill. And certainly without going through the history, inarguably, he shaped and helped win a war. And at the end of that war, if you'll recall, he was voted out of office immediately because he was not the right personality to then shape the future. He saved the world, but he wasn't going to shape the world. But he reemerged, and he became the PM a second time. Upon his retirement, he did a very final press conference. And one of the final question of the Prime Minister was, Mr. Churchill, would you please describe the world in 500 years from now? And then the individual asking the question presumed to provide an answer and said, do you think women will be in charge? And you know what Churchill's answer was?
They already are.
Still? So my view is, having been raised by all women, as the father of all women, I don't see the struggle for women as being a struggle at all. They have forever been in charge. But I admire your persistence. I think there are several things I would say very, very briefly, and it's been described so very well. We're in a world of continual conflict. Let me just state it. However you want to define it, I agree that kinetic conflict is less likely. I have my own view about this, but we could all die from 1,000 cuts if we're not careful. Our engagements online can weaken us. Our engagements online can make us stronger, but we have to be very diligent about how we move through this period. So it requires awareness and engagement on our part, probably much more so than it has in the past. You have to be aware of these challenges at all times. But I would describe this word in a term that we in the Army came up with. I'll take great pride in this. Back in the early 90s, of an acronym called VUCA. Have you heard of the term VUCA, V-U-C-A, before? Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. An acronym to describe our world. And it occurred when you go back and you look at what happened in November of '89, the wall came down, right? And then a year later, what happened, less than a year later, what happened? We went to war, and we won a war in 100 hours. And then what happened 6 months after that? The Soviet Union collapsed. So within 24 months, we had validated our strategy that had guided us for over 40 years. The United States was the sole superpower. All the rules changed. What had guided us, how we had postured ourselves, was now being challenged. The world became, and if you look what happened, post that period, the world became incredibly volatile. We didn't have the big world, but guys like me were suddenly deployed in a whole bunch of small conflicts that were nonetheless incredibly dangerous all over the globe. And we had to get our arms around that. And we had to try to redefine how our military was going to be engaged, how our diplomats were going to be engaged, how we're going to use all elements of power to try to stay engaged. And I would say in many cases, we lost some momentum. We are reclaiming that momentum. We have never lost our position of influence. But we are realizing that in many cases, we have not kept up with some of these changes. So this world of VUCA, as I try to describe it in a very simple way, is the way that I would think we want to view the world going forward, because it's not. We are not going back to anything that is less complicated or less ambiguous than it is today. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, sir. Maura?
Thanks, Mike. And I want to thank everyone who has stayed, because actually I think it's a pretty significant number of people here. I'm really looking forward to having a discussion with all of you. I think the questions have been fantastic thus far. And I want to especially call out the questions from the high school students who have been here, as well as the college students. Not that everyone hasn't been great, but I think you guys have been particularly spectacular, which is part of what gives me, frankly, tremendous hope. Given that the challenges that we've been talking about all day are pretty significant. And so that's what drives me forward and drives, I know, a lot of people I work with forward, that when we have leaders like you all out there, because it really does take all of us. It's not just the folks in government, though certainly we rely on the people in uniform and our diplomats and all those who are in public service, but it takes a community of people across the country to help us solve the kinds of problems and challenges we have in front of us. And so when I look at the title of this panel, sorry, I have no problems with projecting, as you can tell. When I look at the title of this panel, I think about what type of leader it takes to protect and to project for the United States, and what that means right now. What does it mean to be able to secure and defend the United States? Because it means something very different than it has in the past. As Spider pointed out, it's not just kinetic. It is a wide variety of means, and the definitions are changing. And I hearken back to what David Sanger said in our morning discussion, which may seem so long ago. He was applying it to information sharing when he said, we do this, we operate in this way, not because it makes sense in terms of what the threat is or how the threat operates. We do it because it's the system we have. It's precisely that kind of thinking that we need to change if we're going to figure out how we succeed going forward in dealing with the threats that in fact are facing us. And so part of why I'm so excited to be here is in figuring out, this is part of the steps of how we figure out how we go forward and how we continue to succeed, and it's what our nation has frankly always done very effectively, and we just need to double down in how we're going to do it going forward.
Julie?
Well, first of all, thanks to the World Affairs Council for setting this up. The staff and the board, second time back, and let me tell you, Great to be back in Connecticut on a beautiful day. You've not seen outside, but I saw outside earlier today. Went for a run along the river, along the Connecticut rivers for you West Point kids. I did my PT this morning. And then snuck away at lunch and got a, apparently unique to Connecticut, the Connecticut-style lobster roll. I guess that's a thing. So great to be back. And what a topic. Power and protection versus projection. We are, what we say in the Department of Defense, in the era of great power competition. We're using the term competition. It's a bit broader, and it gives you a different visual of what it is we're trying to do. And so, absolutely, there's conflict out there, but we are competing on so many areas within the DoD, within the Department of Defense. And so, whether it's in the Army, long-range precision fires, or if it's in cyberspace. And by the way, and I know this is maybe something we'll talk about, what has changed today? Well, if you read the book, Thank You for Being Late, there's a statement in there about in 2009, Apple came out with the what? The iPhone, right? And the world has never been the same since, all right? And the fight that we have in Southwest Asia, Iraq, Syria, is very much a fight that's online, as well as in the air, on land, and to some degree at sea. And so traditionally we have talked about the domains that we fight in. We fight in the land domain, air, and sea. Well, a fourth domain came out over the last 10 years, and that's cyberspace. And so now when we talk about great power competition, it's not just about fighting in those three domains, the traditional, it's now in cyberspace. And just read the news, or listen to the news, or watch the news any given day. You can't get away without having cyberspace, cybersecurity as part of that discussion. And so how do we measure, where we are as a nation in terms of our ability to project power, right? If you're talking about projecting military power, how many battle carrier groups do we have? How many aircraft do we have? How many brigade combat teams do we have? That's how we would traditionally measure our ability to project power around the world. Well, cyberspace. How do you project power in cyberspace? That's a good question. Maybe you all know, those smart kids over there in the uniforms. We'll see. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks, Garrett. Appreciate it. Actually, all three of the panelists set up all three of my questions, but I might have to change the order. No. So we talked about this evolving strategic environment, a great power competition emerging, and we will have to operate through a VUCA environment. And we talked hard power, we talked soft power. One thing we didn't talk about is that the U.S. has traditionally defined the instruments of national power as diplomacy, information, military, and economics. As we look to those traditional instruments of national power and the change in the environment, do we need to think about a changed approach as we look to the future? From whether it's a integrated approach or whether it's a balance between one or the other, I'd offer that up to the panel.
I would suggest that in order to approach global leadership, or at least what we're trying to get our arms around, our solutions need to be, our obligation as leaders in that environment will be to keep those solutions as simple as possible. We often try to overcomplicate our responses for various reasons, but when you come right down to it, Mike, you're absolutely correct. Every nation, every organization, every entity essentially has those four elements of power, as you've described them. The response is, how do you get those elements of power to work in some type of a synchronized way to achieve your results? Yet organizationally, we have these sleeves. And so you have a senior guy in charge of, and look, I'm from New York, so guy is not a gender thing, okay? So,
but it's a guy a lot more often.
Yeah, well, no. So don't give me any Me Too stuff. So there's somebody in charge of each one of those sleeves. And so how do you organizationally break those sleeves down, organizationally, we can talk about silos and eliminating being silo busters and all that kind of stuff, but how do you organizationally, how do you functionally approach a problem and then be able to subordinate your desire to bring in that element of power with some degree of authority to someone else? So that, what did we see just 2 weeks ago? The Iranians launched a bunch of drones, military element of power, and achieved an incredible economic result. There has not been a concomitant military response. Not certain that that was a synchronized use of all those elements of power, but it certainly achieved that synchronization. So it really is how you can organize, how do you intellectually approach the problem? Like in every problem, the intellectual must precede the physical. So how do you view the problem and organize yourself in a way to be responsive because of the, as John described, the notion of hyperwar and the rate of these decisions, and how are we going to move into this in a way that's effective? So it's an organizational challenge for us to bring all those together.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and just add to it that, I mean, partly 2 stints at the National Security Council of the United States, which is meant to be, though different administrations view it differently, in a coordinating role across government. But we, the United States, struggle with how we coordinate across this massive democracy that we have and a massive bureaucracy, and coordinate all of these elements. And I would say that we're particularly challenged right now because we're dealing with the 2 greatest threats we have, China and Russia. Yep. And I know that others earlier today may not have fully accepted that, but our national defense strategy outlines those as our 2 greatest threats, and I would fully back that. Those 2 countries, among the advantages of authoritarian rule is the ability to do long-term planning and to get to pull all your forces together and force the mobilization of, frankly, your private and your public sectors together, to make your economic forces work for your military and security forces, to have your information not be free-flowing but go to the purposes of your government. All things that are not that are part of how those governments work and are being used, and those countries work, and are being used to disadvantage the United States at this point. And I'm not suggesting that the United States should be doing what Russia and China do, but we should be very mindful of what our major, whether you want to use the word competitors or adversaries, what our major competitors and current threats to us, how they are mobilizing and how they are coordinating, and figure out how we can outsmart them, understanding that we've got to get our arms around and do better than we're doing at the major elements, all the major tools and assets that we have to use. And we've got a lot of work to do.
And that's a great point. And so absolutely China-Russia, we talk about China-Russia every single day in the military. They are our 2 greatest competitors in a lot of different ways, but especially in the cyberspace arena, where, you know, we're not afraid of saying they're taking our stuff, all right? Our intellectual property is being stolen from us. And so how do we get after that, right? Well, one way is that we are partnering more closely with the commercial sector in order to get after that. We know we can't do it alone. This is a whole of government approach, really, if we want to get after. There's a diplomacy piece, and we want to not get into a conflict with them, but we do want to ensure that our interests are protected. And so what do we do about that? And how can we do that? And so it's partnering with the commercial sector that is enabling us to get the tools and the capabilities that we need to be able to compete in that space. And we can talk more about what we do in that space later on. But at a step back, macro level, on the topic of, protectionist versus projection, over the last many years, we've been pulling back our forward forces from around the world. That's just been a consistent evolution within the Department of Defense. We at one time had 300,000 military in Europe, down to about 30,000. We bumped it up a little last year. right? There was at one point we had many in the Middle East and Southwest Asia. We pulled that back significantly. And so now we're realizing that not only do we have interests in Europe and Eastern Europe, where we're responding to a demand signal in Europe, as well as in Asia. It's an interesting time. It's a VUCA problem for us. and it's with the help of the commercial sector and the whole of government approach for us to get after that.
May I jump on that? I really like the way you set that up. And the thing that I struggle with is not only is there competition, but we have to acknowledge, but there are ways that we need to cooperate with these folks that we might view as our adversaries. And we have some scar tissue that tells us how to do that. We figured that out in the past. Primarily, I look at the Chinese. Their military has really advanced their cyber skills phenomenally, but their military historically has always been an internally focused. I mean, they built a wall over the course of like 700 years, not to keep people in, but to keep people out.
They successfully built a wall.
That's right. It was like generational. It's like they're going to get on the wall, pack your lunch, get on the wall. But their military now is expeditionary. It's an over the horizon. They're challenging the notion of spheres of influence. We're going to see Chinese naval battle groups going through the Med. Yep. They're already in Africa. They're in the subcontinent, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we figure out how we cooperate? And so I would commend everybody, if you haven't read Michael Pillsbury's The 100-Year Marathon, read that bad boy. He describes, and he has his thesis, but he's learned, he's talented, he's focused, and he very precisely lays out a theory that, China, by 2049 is going to be, they are, on the 1st, will celebrate their 70th anniversary of the PRC. And in 30 years, they will be the sole superpower. We should be very concerned if in fact they want to try to achieve that. We've got some work to do. I'm of the opinion that won't happen where they will be the sole superpower, but there are some things we need to do that require our ability to cooperate. We have to be able to figure it out.
If I could build off your point, building off my point, for us,
please do.
For our strategy with China includes maintaining open lines of communication with their military. Sure. And it's because we believe that military to military, if we have good cooperation, that could be one of the stabilizing forces in place that keeps us and China in a better place. And so that's why we use the term competition as well, because we want to be in a better place. If we use the term conflict, then that already conjures up a mental image of us and them. And our strategy over the horizon is to be in a better place.
So if I can, I'm just going to pull on that thread because we touched on it. We talked a little bit about how we've used the traditional instruments of power. It's a whole of government approach that's successful. But if you, at least from my experience, if we look to the past, we focused on projection more than we have on protection, and that's part of the panel discussion that I wanted to get to. In fact, actually, the title, as Maura pointed out, that the title of our panel is Protection versus Projection. I would like the panel to give their insights about whether is there a different balance, or is there a balance as we look towards the future between projection of power and protection of our national security?
Maura's first.
So, first of all, the reason to me it seemed pretty automatic that there was an and there and not a versus is not just because I'm a lawyer, and don't hold that against me, that I read every word. But that there is a continuum and a balance of how the United States is positioned power-wise around the world. And Garrett, you just talked about, you spoke to the change in the number of forward positioning of the forces that we have around the world, and questions on where and how that came about, and that's again across administrations, Democratic and Republican. So there's not a party issue in that. There's kind of a national sense of that, whether some of that balance needs to change. and not just where the forces are, but what the connective tissue is in how and why. As we've pulled back from Europe and as we've pulled back from the Middle East, guess who goes into that vacuum in various ways? It's Russia and it's China, and it's economically. So it's not just that China is appearing in Asia, it's that China is filling in the gaps in Europe and in Latin America and throughout Africa, and that China and Russia are working together in those ways. And so that's where questions about how we rebalance, it may involve, yes, more military forward positioned. It also may be thinking differently about how we're doing things economically and what we're doing economically. And that goes to, it's not just that we talk whole of government, but our government cannot do it by themselves. It's what we do as a people and what we understand as a people in terms of what kinds of new creative public-private partnerships can we work out. Because it is going to take a variety of different types of ways of thinking and looking at what projection means and what protection means. So I think probably getting the national sense of why it's important to have more forward positioning, whether it's diplomats or people in uniform, and not just people in government positions, but a whole different way of the importance of the global interconnectedness and what it means for the United States to be in a leadership position and why that ultimately serves US interests and American interests, and the connection between that and making a stronger and more stable world.
A great point. I mean, I like the leadership piece. If there's a vacuum of leadership, it will get filled, right? If there's a vacuum of capability, it will get filled, right? If we pull units out of certain parts of Eastern Europe, guess what? Other units go back right into it, right? Kazakhstan shares a 4,000 mile border with Russia. Kazakhstan wants to be our friend. They want to be more Western-like, but they can't ignore, that country to the north of them. And they can't ignore the oil fields in Russia above that help drive the economy for the Kazakhs, as an example. And so that Central Asia area is kind of left alone sometimes, but that's an area where if we don't pay attention to, for example, someone else will. That's just an example. That is true around the world, though. It is true every country around the world. If there's absence of leadership or capability, it will get filled by someone.
Well, fair to say that we can't go alone. It's a global community. Right. Our numbers are going to reduce. Our military numbers are going to reduce for whatever political reasons, financial reasons, budgetary constraints. We are absolutely reliant on partners and friends and guys and gals who are on the fence. And we want to convince them to come to this side of the fence. And so we've got elements of power in order to do that.
The question is, can multiple superpowers coexist in some kind of harmony, right? And if you're talking about Asia, you're talking about a hegemony. And who wants to be that? And we can't put all our forces out there. We have a lot of different interests.
We just have to be able to understand. Yeah. We have to put our finger on the trap lines, yep. So we can kind of feel what's happening, and then we can do what's necessary economically, right. Diplomatically. I mean, we have choices. What concerns me, obviously, is that forever what defined our national security strategy was a very clear competition with the Soviet Union, and then that worked out. And what was China doing the whole time? They were hiding in plain sight. I mean, we think about it, we had SALT talks, we had START talks, and we turned the temperature down. Thousands and thousands of nukes. They still have thousands. Russians have thousands. We have thousands. You know how many the Chinese have? They've got like 400. But that's a distinction without a difference. I mean, that's like too many. But it's just happening. But I mean, it's just happening. And now we're going, oh my goodness. And so you have Russia, which has never really been a superpower. It had nukes. So we ascribe to it superpower status, but its economy's in the crapper. But it has a strong man, it feels good about itself, it becomes incredibly provocative. And what happens, what does history tell us about a very strong country that feels good about itself but is in decline? They lash out. That concerns me greatly. So are we paying attention to that, oh, by the way, we still had to pay attention and figure out how we're going to cooperate with this entity called China.
Just a quick, because I would say that so people don't misinterpret harmony. Harmony doesn't need to mean kumbaya,
Right.
and it's not
No,
likely
right.
to be.
Yeah, coexist. Without being at
Coexisting.
war.
And finding the strategic alliances, which is, again, for anyone who's looked at the National Defense Strategy, and for those who haven't, I highly recommend it. The public version, 11 pages, short, thanks to former Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis. It's an easily readable document that's actually a coherent strategy. I bring it up now because not only does it outline clearly what the threats are as defined by this administration, it also clearly talks about the major priorities in dealing with them, the second of which is strengthening our strategic alliances.
Yes.
And so the importance of figuring out, knowing that you in the United States cannot or should not be in a position of doing it alone, whatever it is you need to do, you're going to be more strengthened by working with those who are allied with you, and that can take a lot of different forms in a lot of different contexts.
Great point. I mean, and especially to the West Point cadets. You know, the three priorities of the National Defense Strategy is increased lethality, is partnerships and allies, and it's reform. Real simple. Reform how we do business. But the allies and partnerships is critical for us, and it's the first time that I've seen it come from the top, from the Pentagon, which was absolutely outstanding. In 2014, I was in Kuwait. It was supposed to be a nice, easy arson job, and then 2 weeks later, I'm sending my team back into Iraq, and we hadn't been there since 2011, and so it was a crazy year. But before we went in, we lined up all our partners. He said, we aren't doing this alone. That was the very first thing General Terry started working, and General Austin at CENTCOM started working, was the partnerships piece. Started making phone calls, and spot on, Maura.
I have 10 more questions, and yet now I have to turn it over to the audience. So the same rules apply, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm going to reserve the right to the last 10 minutes. So you have about 15 minutes for your questions, and I'm going to start right here, sir, on the right.
Thank you, Pat Sheehan from Hartford. General, I was pleased to hear you mention Michael Pillsbury's book. One of the things that he pointed out was, in a sense, how we got suckered, how we sort of stepped into it ourselves by somehow projecting our values on the values that the Chinese might have, and just believed that they wanted to become a part of the nations of the world and cooperate and do all of that, and we ended up giving away so much of our intellectual property and military information to them that we might have otherwise done differently had we known really what the motivations were. My question is, do we sometimes project on others what our values are without recognizing the cultural differences? I'll leave it at that.
Always.
Always.
As an Intel guy, biggest challenge that we had is, I have my own biases. The team of young men and women that you assemble have biases. And it's incredibly difficult to try to penetrate into someone else's culture or whatever. And one thing that the military, I think, did incredibly well is they created a program years ago that was called the Foreign Area Officer Program. And to become a FAO, the Army, I'll speak for the Army, would invest tons of money in the development of these incredibly precious resources. Language training, in-country training, advanced studies, internments, travel. It was just phenomenal. And then at some point, the Army would cut them off because they didn't fit the mold of the Army's view of what they're trying to create, which is this lethal, square-jawed soldier, whatever. So we would not necessarily get the best and the brightest into that world, which is exactly where we needed them. And so what do you end up doing? You've got to have you have to have a very strong intelligence community who can go find sources who can come and help you better understand what you're looking at. So I used to describe it, look, I'm a pig looking at a watch. I don't know what I'm looking at. So let me get somebody to tell me what I'm looking at so I can better understand. So we routinely do that. Not just with the Chinese. Everything you described, Michael Pillsbury does say, we do that routinely where we are. Wherever we go, we struggle.
Or I know your experiences.
No.
That's great.
I think it was well said. Yeah. We always get it wrong.
Yes.
That's right.
Exactly.
That's right.
Right?
Got
Yeah.
high school.
Thank you. Hello. I'm Jackson. Sorry, I have a cold. But my question is, what can the U.S. do to remain more influential in the face of emerging powers such as China? Like, how can the U.S. continue to show its allies that we're still the predominant power, especially in this time of increasing isolationism? Yeah, thank you.
Great question, young man.
Who wants to start?
Go,
That's
brother.
a good question. I don't know that we know the answer to that one, because that is a very thought-provoking question. Obviously, you know, that question potentially touches a bunch of topics, all right? So I'm in uniform on the military side, I can speak to that. And it's kind of back to what we just talked about with partnerships. You know, last month I hosted about 50 international military students attending U.S. Army schools. And we brought them together in Washington, D.C. We gave them a reception, and we do this every month. And so the way we show that we are engaged and that we are there to support is this continued engagement with our partners on the military side.
I would actually build on that, though, and say sometimes countries are actually not all that different from people. And so think of it in terms of how it is that you've got you know, a bad actor. I'm using that in terms of like a person in your school or in your community who you know is a big problem, and they've got a bunch of people with them who are problems. And what are your options in terms of you can on your own project something that's going to necessarily change that person's behavior, but how can you get a group of people around you who are going to strengthen both what you think is right and what they think is right? What's going to be important to you in that group? It's going to be I found, at least, being consistent in what you say and how you say it, putting out points that make sense, ideally being able to have some strength to back up what you're saying, whether it's guys who are in uniform and carry some power with them, some economic power, some other things that the other people in the room, once you've talked to them and figure out what they need and are good listeners to understand what they're concerned about, figure out what they need and how you can help them, and you are able to tell them what you need and figure out how they can help you. And in that way, I'm putting it simply, but the good actors get together and know that they can rely on one another. But as with people, you're only as good as your word is. You've got to be able to show up, and people have got to know that you're going to consistently show up for them. And you build capital that way. And part of what happens, and this is part of why I'm worried about our country right now, is either when you stop showing up, or your word doesn't mean what you've said it means, it takes a long time to get that back. And that's part of what I think we're struggling with, right? Because we both have to be able to work to get that back in some, not everywhere, but in some places, though we have very receptive audiences, because there's a lot of parts of the world that are very concerned, that share our concerns about things that our competitors are doing, and want to rely on us. But we've got to get smarter about what we're doing. We've got to be more consistent in what we're saying and how we're saying it. And we've got to be much more organized internally on that third pillar of the National Defense Strategy, not just reforming how the Defense Department works, but how we operate internally as a government and with all of our partners. So we've got a tall order of things to do, but there are ways to break it down into smaller pieces to work at the very important things you've laid out.
If I can, that was exceptional. I mean that was absolutely exceptional. You know, young man, how old are you? 16. I love it. So the two words that you said that I absolutely embrace are show up. I have 3 daughters, and the only thing I said, I probably said too many things to my daughters when they were growing up, you know, and I know I routinely pissed them off. I know I pissed their mother off a bunch, and she'd tell me to please be quiet. But before they departed, before each one of those beautiful little kids walked out the door to go to college, I said, I want you to remember one thing. Remember who had your last name first, okay? That was a matter of showing up. Look, I'm on a very personal level, so I want you to personalize this. On a very personal level, look, I'm the son of a soldier who's the son of a soldier, so big generational kind of a deal going on, family business. I don't want to screw that up. I woke up every morning praying that I wouldn't screw it up. And the way I would do that is I'd look at my boss and I'd go, I'm going to show up. I'm going to show up for you. I'm going to be there for you. That's what America's got to do. We got to show up. And we're going to show up to those who mean us harm, and we're going to punch them in the throat. We're going to crush them. We're just going to take care of business, man. And those that want to be our buddies, we're going to embrace them, and we're going to be there for them. And we're going to use all those elements of power to make it right for them and for us. Shared national values.
Next question. Very, very far in the back. Run like the wind.
Hello, I'm a senior in high school. My name is Brendan. And my question was, so if you look at the world currently, you have like regions like Hong Kong where you have this oppressive power subjugating these people and like it being a very real threat to them. You have regions like Darfur where we've had like these ethnic cleansings and like the brutal like murders of civilians like for the past like 15 years. And then you have places like Rohingya or Bangladesh and Myanmar where the Rohingya Muslims are constantly being persecuted. Does the United States have a burden to protect these people, to be like this sort of protectorate of the oppressed and harboring of democracy in the 21st century? Do you think it's feasible for that to even happen? And just any thoughts on that?
Go National Security Council.
Well, so Brendan, first, I'm really amazed that between this morning and this afternoon, you're not already like a college junior at least. So, and I'm sure you're on an accelerated track somewhere. Again, great questions and very hard questions. And I say hard because when the United States, when any country intervenes anywhere, and how are some of the toughest questions to answer, certainly when you're in government. And I'll say this is from my perspective, both being in the executive branch and having spent a good chunk of time in kind of my formative years on Capitol Hill as the chief counsel for the House Foreign Affairs Committee under a wonderful man named Lee Hamilton, who was the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee when I worked for him. And why do I bring that up? Because hearing, for me, some of the times when members of Congress would be the most serious, and I recognize many people don't hear those words together very often or thinking of them together, was in debates over war powers, which is the decision about when, and the war powers authorizations are not often brought to the floor of the House or the Senate because members of Congress don't necessarily like to take votes on those things. They like to complain that they don't get the right to vote, but they don't also like to vote and debate on these topics because those are topics about when and how you deploy US forces overseas, when and how you intervene. When those debates happened on the House floor, I saw members of Congress at their most serious, when they actually had to confront the questions about when and how and in what situations the United States had the right or had the obligation to be intervening. Some people felt very strongly, and I also saw presidents debate that, and from the executive branch perspective and National Security Council principles debate it. So a range of issues from, are there United States interests at stake? Are they United States security interests? Do they go to the obligation to secure and defend the people of the United States? Are there broader global interests at stake? Are the people who are being hurt, the countries at issue, are they our friends? Are they our allies? Does that extend the United States strategic interest? And should that be some of what we factor in? Or is it just that and I don't mean just, but are the countries at issue doing things that are so horrendous to the global or international order that that in itself merits United States intervention? So all of those things factor in, and if I went to look back over each of the situations you mentioned, and probably others that I could add in over the last 20 or 30 years, there's not a consistency to what the United States has decided to do and how we've necessarily decided to do it.
Great answer.
Yeah, good answer.
Yes, ma'am, right in front. Please do.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Tammy. I was wondering if we had some comments on the United States projection of power in the Middle East specifically. I mean, it's gotten us in trouble in the past, and if we're maybe putting less of a projection emphasis and more of a protection of our interests in the region?
I'll start. We struggle with balancing the limited number of forces that the military has to project presence around the globe. And so part of withdrawing those 300 troops from Europe was a recognition also, it wasn't just the peace dividend, a recognition of threats elsewhere around the world that we needed to, balance. We also drew down our forces as well, and that had something to do with it. And every time we try to, tie a bow around the Middle East and focus on the Pacific for a while, for example, the China-Asia problem set, we keep getting pulled back into Southwest Asia and the Middle East. And then we try to focus on Eastern Europe because that's a problem, and we get pulled back into the Middle East. That's how it's been the past probably last 10 years or so, as we've tried to, you may have heard a couple years, pivot to the Pacific, and then we rebalance the Pacific, and we keep coming back. It's definitely, something that we struggle with. What's the right mix of military forces along with the rest of the diplomatic, the dime, right, the economic piece, right?
As Jim Mattis said when he first, in his confirmation, if you don't increase it, this is the guy who's the Secretary of Defense, if you don't increase the amount of money you spend on our State Department and our diplomatic corps and our efforts diplomatically, you better start buying me a heck of a lot more bullets. So it's how you balance the application of all these elements. It's the synchronization of all those elements of power.
No, I'd just say the only thing I'd add is what typically happens, and this is part of why we don't get it right more often, is that we are in places and then we get frustrated that we're not getting the results or whatever else happens, and we remove our military, but we don't have either the glide path to do that between our military and what our economic support or our development support is going to be. So we don't do what Secretary Gates was quoted earlier as asking what's next. Having the what's next plan and the national strategic patience to recognize that if you're substituting one type of assistance, you probably need to work with other elements as well. It's not that you can or it's going to cost you to just pack up entirely and go home. And yet we don't learn that lesson very well as a country.
We'll go right to the middle. And I'll come back for the next one over to the left because I know I've avoided it. So, Amanda says one more. One more? or do it?
Maybe those last two questions, maybe that's our final one?
Okay.
After the second one?
All right.
But whatever you think.
Man, I'm not used to be on the receiving end of the Grim Reaper here.
We got like 5 minutes, I guess, huh? Is that what it is? All right, we'll be succinct in our responses.
Yes. The question's right there.
You're waiting for Mike.
No, sorry, y'all.
Hello, Cadet Cody again. Of course, West Point. So I wanted to ask your opinion on diplomatically and militarily. We've been talking a lot about the shift from COIN or counterterrorism efforts to near-peer exploration and what that means for moving forward in the future. So I want to get each of your perspectives on that component. Thank you.
You want to start?
Are you going to put a few questions together?
Oh,
though?
yeah. You got it.
I'm just going to do, I'll do that one, and we'll do the second one, we'll put them together so that we can answer in a combined.
I'll be quick on the military piece
Far
then.
over on the corner.
Coin kind of went away, but it didn't go away. We did a lot of coin in, Southwest Asia, and we rebranded within the Army our doctrine to be focused on great power competition, meaning the big fight, which is why the focus on readiness within the Army. But if you see what we have just put out there, these security forces assistance brigades, they're kind of doing coin. So you're not going to see coin in the doctrine as much, but you'll see it happening in our action with these new brigades that we're positioning literally around the world. So coin's not gone, it's just not as prominent in our textbooks, I guess.
We used to call that, I think I cut myself off. We used to call that lesser included, which was a terrible term. In other words, you got to do this, but there are a whole bunch of lesser included things you have to do, and thank goodness we got rid of that. It's just a broad set of missions that are required. So you young men and women are going to enter into an Army that has to have a structure to it. I mean, you have to fit someplace. It's not amorphous, but you're going to be asked to do, just a plethora of missions.
Last question.
I'm Dan from University of Connecticut, real quick. My question is, we focus on external threats for obvious reasons, but my question at the end of the day is an internal threat, and the extent to which the erosion of the idea of America, the very idea, is a national security threat.
I'm looking at Mara.
So what I would just say is actually I listened to Jim Mattis speak a couple days ago, and I haven't read his book yet, so I'm not sure if that's a major theme of his book. It certainly is a major theme of his public speaking at this point, is his concern about, he did not use those terms, but his concern about the fraying of America, let me put it in the positive, the statement about the need for America to come together and do better at listening to one another and finding the room for common ground, even among those with disparate views, and that what I did hear him say is he thought that he used similar terminology to you in the sense of the greatest threat that we face is internal, that we need to find ways to do far better than we have been doing, that we have all of, and this is me, I'm not going to try to quote him anymore, that I do feel like we have all of the elements that we need here as a country to be able to overcome that threat. And again, I just harken back to this is just one room and one group of people in one state. But part of what World Affairs Council does in many places across the country and other groups like World Affairs Council, there is something that is uniquely American about this. And so that's why I think that we have all of the fabric and all the threads in this country to be able to meet that threat or meet that challenge. But I really do think it takes every person possible, every engaged person, and every engaged person to get more engaged people to come together to meet that threat, because it is quite a significant one.
And we have to avoid the temptation to challenge or at least restrict individual liberties as a solution, and maybe at the same time increase control mechanisms so that we can get our arms around it. I mean, that would be an easy solution, and we've been there before, and it was absolutely the wrong solution. And John Allen talked about it today. The Chinese moving servers into the United States because we can't, with complete impunity, go dive into those things. There are restrictions, there are laws that prohibit that. We have to be very, very careful about trying to find a solution that's going to create far greater concerns, problems.
So I think we get the hook, so I'm doing the closing.
Yeah, you've got the
Closing remarks?
last word.
So,
Well, I might take the last word, but
You'll go across to you. How's that? So thanks again to the World Affairs Council of Connecticut. I love the Connecticut lobster roll. So I want to come back next year. Please invite me back so I get another lobster roll. But on behalf of the men and women currently serving, thank you all for the support. We need and appreciate the support that we get, and it's informed citizens like you all in this room, many of which I know are veterans as well, that we have, a great military, a strong military. And so thank you all, and thank you for sharing this. Yeah.
So I'll finish with just a simple thanks to the three panelists who are so very busy, but to spend an hour with them here on the stage and have a conversation with all of you is both humbling and rewarding for me personally. So thanks to all of you.
Thank you.